Hello, and welcome to this edition of Energy Connects discussion with me, Julian Walker, as I speak to leading energy executives and experts around the world. Energy Connects, our global platform for the entire energy industry. Today, I'm delighted to welcome again the CEO of Qamar Energy, Robin Mills. Thanks so much for joining me again.
Thank you. Thanks, Julian. Hello, everyone.
Today, we thought we would discuss the current state of the energy industry. So obviously a lot to delve into. And just to start off, Robin, I wanted to sort of gauge what your outlook for the energy industry is while it faces quite a number of crises and hurdles.
Yeah, sure. Well, we're obviously in really an immensely challenging period for global energy consumers. Let's say they're under squeeze on all sides, really, whether you look at gas or oil or coal even, or you look at the renewable supply chain, all of them are under huge pressure. And, we're seeing world record prices for gas and electricity in particular, for LNG around the world, for electricity in Europe and other places. US gas prices have revived, remarkably after years in the doldrums. And oil prices are, I'd say relatively high. They're not at record levels, but they're also quite high. But particularly end user fuel prices are very, very high. And if you talk about petrol or diesel prices at the pump, exceptionally high as well. So, really the energy complex coming under pressure on all fronts. And I think that makes this a very interesting energy crisis from the point of an analyst, from an academic point of view. But, we shouldn't be oblivious to the very real human cost that this imposes on consumers around the world, but particularly in poorer countries who struggle to pay their energy bills or suffer from shortages. And this feeds through, we need to remember this is also not just energy costs, but we also know this is affecting food, it's affecting metals and other commodities as well. So really a very challenging crisis on many fronts for policymakers to deal with. From the energy industry point of view, though, it's obviously good to be on the other side. Oil prices are strong, gas prices are very, very strong. If you're an existing producer, you're in a good position. I think what's interesting, though, is we hear this persistent theme of underinvestment, and particularly in the hydrocarbon sector, and that I think will be an ongoing theme. In past energy crises, when prices went up, that there would be a rush of investment, and after a few years, new supply would come on stream, will bring that down. And we're not really seeing that now. Well, yes, we're seeing, a moderate step up in activity in the US, seeing a little bit more work in exploration around the world, some of the Middle East producers expanding, but, not a dramatic rush to invest. And that's obviously because of the longer term imperative of climate change and emerging zero carbon technologies, which means that oil and gas producers think, well, I'm enjoying the good times now, but can I really be sure that the demand will be there and the prices will be strong in 5 or 10 years' time?
Absolutely. Obviously, Qatar's made quite a few announcements, and that's on the LNG side. Some the global partners, and that's certainly one. But again, I agree there doesn't seem to be a flurry of investment news.
No, absolutely. And Qatar's expansion plans, of course, have been in the works for several years. They're not a response to the potential loss of Russian gas and the need to produce more LNG. They'll be very helpful in replacing that gas and in putting more LNG on the market, of course, by 26, 27 or so. But they're not an immediate response. And we've seen European policymakers and government officials and others beating the path to the Gulf, to Qatar and Abu Dhabi and Riyadh, and hoping for more energy. But the plain fact is there isn't a lot to spare energy from these big producers right now. Of course, they're all producing. Certainly on the gas side, they're all producing flat out. On the oil side, they've been increasing production, and there isn't a lot that they can do in the near term. Given a few years, yes, there is.
Yeah, and I think the impact then from Russia's invasion, and obviously the tightening of sanctions, but also the European actions. What do you think? Have they got it out in the right way, or they've obviously got winter coming up, and also you see the Europeans are scrambling for energy, which at current stage there isn't a lot of it spare out there.
No, well, look, I think there's a few different elements to this. The one is at the sanction side. Yeah, Russia's actions, there has to be a very strong response, and that clearly has to involve sanctions. And it is kind of an absurd situation where firstly, where Europe has got so dependent on Russian energy, and then secondly, where it's effectively financing Vladimir Putin's war by still buying these large amounts of oil and gas. So it's inevitable. I think these sanctions will be imposed and they'll get tighter. I think the question is, how intelligent are they? There's a blanket ban on oil imports into the EU, and these seaborne oil imports to be come to force by the end of the year. US and UK have already banned Russian oil imports. And gas is a kind of attempt to phase out most Russian gas imports over a period of a few years. Now, I think there's two problems to this. First one is obviously that these kind of bans drive up prices, and that's inevitable. But it's also, does that mean that these bans are politically sustainable? And that's probably part of the Russian calculation that they're not, and eventually there'll be pressure to compromise. And the second part is, are these policies intelligently designed? Is there a better way to design them? So we've seen talk recently about putting a cap on oil prices from Russia. So to say, we will buy it only at somewhere between $60 to $80 a barrel and no more. Yes. Again, I for various reasons I don't find that a very feasible policy. However, what I've argued is a cleverer way would be to say just put a very stiff tariff on Russian oil. So basically say any importer, yes, you'll pay the market price, but you'll take a big chunk of that in a tariff, so that the earnings to the Russians will be very small. And that's the way you might get China and India and others to come in, because they could say, well, yeah, I too would rather keep a big chunk of this money at home rather than paying it to Russia and still get access to oil supplies. So, I think that'd be a better policy, but, that just depends on some coordination between the EU and the US and UK to start with, and then others. Yeah. So that's kind of tricky. That's on the sanctions policy. I think then there's the other question is, okay, how does Europe in particular replace Russian energy?
Yes.
So obviously for oil, well, they look to OPEC, and OPEC has been increasing production, but Russia, of course, is in the OPEC plus mechanism. Most OPEC countries are maxed out or close to it. Saudi Arabia and the UAE have some spare capacity. Iraq has a little. Beyond that, really not much. So that's problematic. Because they even at producing at maximum capacity, and there are some questions over their spare capacity. I think that they probably do have substantial spare capacity, but even if they deploy it all, it's definitely not enough to make up for Russian oil exports. Then you have the gas side, which is even more problematic, because as we've just said, that there's no spare LNG. There's a very limited pool of spot LNG, which Europeans are competing for very aggressively, and that means other countries have to go without. And once that's allocated, there is nothing else. And this is where I think the disappointing side of European policy is, to say, oh yeah, okay, we'll burn more coal. Well, we don't really like to do that, but we kind of have to. But really, it's not to look seriously at increasing domestic gas production as far as that can be done. Not to look at trying to save nuclear power in Germany and keep that running a little bit longer. And hardly to look at efficiency. I do this. I find bewildering. I'm like, whether you're an environmentalist or hardline security hawk or whatever, energy efficiency, that's the one policy everybody should be able to agree on. And just being much more aggressive on insulating and using low energy equipment and stuff, getting an army of workers out there. We try to put people to work, right? Get an army of workers out there to be insulating homes and so on ahead of the winter, protecting low income consumers. And yet I just see minimal action on this from European governments. So you're in the summer right now, you don't need the home heating, but give it 3 or 4 months and you will, and you'll wish you'd taken the opportunity.
Yeah. What about as you said, they're all coming here as well, different parts of the world, but obviously the Middle East, there's a real demand to increase production. We'll see what they've got here. So the Middle East has played a sort of a balancing act of in this conflict, and I wonder what your thoughts about that going forward.
Well, I think the Middle East has largely tried to stay out of this on a political side and stay neutral. They have, on the whole, depends which country you look at, but let's say the Gulf generally has strong relations with the US and with Europe, and has done for many years. But they have China is a huge partner of theirs and a huge investor, but also a huge consumer and customer. And Russia is an important partner too, in some ways, in more limited ways, but particularly within the OPEC Plus alliance. And I think OPEC says it was very hard bringing this alliance together. We tried to bring Russia into an OPEC framework for like 20 years without success. Finally, we achieved that. We don't want to throw that away over a political dispute that we don't feel we're part of, because who knows, next year demand may fall, we may need more OPEC cuts, and then we'll regret that Russia isn't in the agreement anymore. So that preserving that alliance is definitely become a key part of their policy.
And you actually point about there, and you're starting to read in newspapers around Europe about coal returning or increasing in production. So where's that where do you see that leads to sort of the renewable energy side, business wise, in sort of Europe and other parts of the developed world?
Well, the move to coal is pretty regrettable. It's a real condemnation, I think, of a lot of policy failings. However, at least in Europe, it's temporary. And Europe will in a few years we'll get over this and we'll start return to phasing out coal again. This crisis, it's very good for the renewable energy side because Europe has already accelerated its plans, and of course renewable energy at these oil and gas prices becomes extremely attractive, even more than it already was. So we'll see a huge acceleration of renewables. We've seen that already. The problem obviously is you then run into bottlenecks, supply chain problems, and we're seeing that renewable energy costs actually starting to go up again after years of declines, and even to the point then of certain systems physically not being available, and very high dependence on China, particularly in the solar power supply chain, and increasingly in batteries as well. So that's a concern for Europe. They don't want to repeat their dependence on Russia in oil and gas, where it depends on China in supply chains. And I think US will have the same issue too. But then you've got to say, okay, if you want to build these renewable energy systems in Europe or the US, can you do it competitively, or do you accept that, well, unfortunately, renewables are going to have to get a bit more expensive if we're building them at home, and maybe won't be available in the quantities that we need for a few years. It's pretty difficult conundrum. But again, I think this is a problem of 3-4 years. The renewable supply chain will get through this, and renewable expansion will be faster and stronger because of it. And hopefully we'll see some kind of interesting breakthroughs in some new low carbon technologies at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely. And hopefully we'll hear that at some of our shows coming up at Gastech in Milan in September, and obviously ADIPEC. And look, Robin, I'd like to thank you for giving me your time today. And hopefully speak to you at both of those shows and see where we are. But it's going to obviously, I think, be an interesting summer going into winter for the energy industry.
Yes, thank you. I look forward to seeing you there too.
Thanks for listening, and I look forward to bringing you more engaging conversations soon.